Okay. Well, dear friends of the Dante Alighieri Society, good evening and welcome to our online conference. But before, as it is customary, on behalf of the Dante Alighieri Society, I would like to acknowledge the Gadigal people of the Eora Nation, the custodian of the land, and recognize their continuing connection to the land, waters, and culture. We pay our respects to their elders, past, present, and emerging. This evening, Dr. Karen McCluskey will speak on a subject that is particularly dear to my heart. That is, the painted portraits that adorned the mummified bodies, not Egyptian, as you would think or believe, but Roman. Roman, you ask? Yes, we are talking of a period of about the 1st, 2nd, and 3rd century AC, when Egypt had become a Roman province after the Battle of Actium in 31 BC, which concluded with the defeat of Cleopatra's and Mark Antony's fleet. Egypt then became the granary of Rome, and the port of Alexandria a center of great economic importance. A large and rich class of merchants grew on this commerce, and in a typical Roman custom, quickly adopted the custom of the conquered subject, in this case, the custom of embalming the dead, but different from the old Egyptian custom of placing a gold idolized mask on the face of the pharaohs, just think of the mask of Tutankhamun, placed a realistic portraits of the dead painted on a wooden board. Many such portraits were found in Fayum, south of Cairo, but not only there. I better stop here before I'm carried away by my enthusiasm for the subject, and better let Dr. McCluskey speak with greater knowledge on tonight's topic. Most of you know, but Associate Professor Dr. McCluskey is an art historian with a particular research focus on the intersection of art and lived religious experience in the later Middle Ages, especially in Italy. The author of some important monographs, Karen is currently working on representation of disability and impairment of pictorial hagiography of Beata Fina dei Ciardi in the 15th century San Gimignano in Tuscany. Karen received a PhD from the University of Sydney in 2006 and has been teaching history and art history at the University of Notre Dame, Australia, since its inception in Sydney in 2006. So, with many thanks, I now let Karen open your eyes to a lesser known part of Roman art and wish you all buon ascolto. Karen, to you.
Thank you so much, Fabio. It's so nice to be here, and it's just wonderful to be able to look at another form of art that I don't often get the chance to sort of indulge in, which is the art of Roman Egypt. So I'm just going to share my screen with you because it will be a visual feast. And hopefully, let me just put on full screen. There we go. Hopefully everybody can see that. So the talk is going to be in 4 parts. First of all, I'm going to introduce you to the topic of discussion, which is the portraits. And I'm going to look a little bit at their historical context, which Fabio's just relayed a little bit of. I'm going to also introduce a concept called cultural entanglement, which I think is a better way of understanding the portraits and will give us some food for thought. Then we'll analyze the portraits within Egyptian and Greco-Roman religious and visual conventions, and then we'll make some conclusions. So it's a lot to accomplish in an hour's time, but hopefully we can get there without too much problem. The images were largely found in a necropolis near Fayum, near modern-day Hawara in Egypt. Famously and quite accidentally discovered in 1887 by archaeologist William Flinders Petrie. while searching for the tomb of a much more famous pharaoh, he stumbled upon a huge cemetery in which he found mummies with funerary portrait masks. Now, there are about 900 mummies that have been discovered since then, mostly but not exclusively in this region. The portraits, as Fabio mentioned, are largely dated to the first 3 centuries after Christ's birth. And so that puts us in the period of the Roman colonization of Egypt after 31 BC. So let's have a look at some of these beautiful images. This is my shout out to Vermeer, woman with pearl earrings. Here we have a female figure who appears very large in relation to her background. So this signals her importance within the picture field. She's shown in 3/4 view. Her glance ever so slightly off to our right gives her a wistful appearance. She dons a deep red tunic with a clavis edged in gold. You can see that here, that's the clavis, the stripe with the gold. And she wears ball earrings and around her neck a gold chain with a crescent pendant attached. Her hair is pulled back in a bun with ringlets escaping along the fringe. It's a bit hard to see because of the darkness of the image, but there are ringlets there. But there are also these lovely ringlets down the back of her neck, which was very fashionable at the time. Her eyes are large and almond-shaped with large, deeply tinted arched eyebrows. Extending from the juncture of the eyebrows is her nose. It is small and delicate. The lips are full and painted rose pink. Her flesh is creamy with tints of pink on the cheeks and chin. The naturalism of the image is extraordinary. The fine modeling of the flesh and the use of chiaroscuro, which is the light-dark modeling, or the use of light and shadow in modeling, evokes a volume which is remarkable. We note especially here the rotundity of her eyes, accomplished through that delicate light-dark modeling, the white highlight on her nose to assert its prominence. Can you see my actual cursor there? Yeah, thank you. So you can see the white sort of swathe of paint that's been put on her nose to draw attention to it, and the gentle sculpting of her lips through that degradation of hue. Now I've lost my own mouse, there we go, across the lip there. Okay, and that kind of variation gives it a kind of puckered appearance. The artist includes other vivid details, such as the shimmery white highlights on the pearls, which you can see again over here, the little dab of white paint, and also the white flecks on the necklace, which draw attention to the glistening surfaces of the objects being relayed there. So what we have here is a very captivating image, teeming with life, despite its funerary context. This is a point worth remembering. On to our second image. Here we have girl with a gold wreath. So this image here shows a girl who is about 12 to 14 years old, peering out of the image into the viewer's realm. Similar to the previous image, she has curly hair and it's piled upon her head in a fashionable bun. She wears a red tunic with black stripes, and she also has pearl earrings. It's a little bit tricky to see them, but they are there. Again, fashionable at the time. This girl wears a wreath of golden leaves, rendered with actual gold leaf in recognition of her family's wealth, and also signaling the divine favor she enjoys in her afterlife. The modeling of the face is very accomplished, using that light and dark shadow again. And here the artist renders a very vibrant figure. The warm tones as well give her a vivacious presence. She has a powerful gaze. It's delicately modeled with reds and greens, violets and orange. And these are complementary contrasts which encourage volume and energy in an image. There are also the white highlights that you can see, especially in this little detail that I have here, the little white fleck that is an illusionistic technique to capture light in an image. And so all of this makes her appear very much alive despite her young passing. The gaze, the puckered mouth, the three-quarter view inject an animate spirit into the painting, giving the impression that this girl is about to respond to a question. Portrait of a man. It's another image with a direct gaze and a ready expression. Here he dons a white mantle and tunic with a violet clavis, which you can only just see here. He has a short haircut, bushy eyebrows, a long aquiline nose, and deep-cut cheeks. Here the portrait resounds with that almost brutal verism of imperial Roman portraiture, a style that emphasizes a sitter's true facial characteristics, warts and all, as they say. And so what we note with this figure is he has prominent wrinkles on his neck. You can see that down here. He has wrinkles around his eyes, and also that kind of dark circle, which suggests, that this man has endured hard work. So all of this around the eyes. Like our previous image, the eyes and mouth suggest a moment of engagement, as though he is thinking, hence the squinting eyes, and the almost imperceptible opening of his mouth. He's a little bit like the Mona Lisa in that regard, that he's just about to comment on something or to react to an intruder. Another couple of images, portraits of young men from the 1st century AD. And again, these have similar features, but are identifiably different people with individual characteristics. The figure on the left, for instance, has elongated facial features, a curly coif, large eyes framed by heavy eyebrows and heavy lashes. He's got beautiful lush lips, an elongated neck, and deep olive skin. This is indeed a real man. The modeling of the face using light and shadow and the enhanced white highlights presents him in 3 dimensions. We note here, as in the previous images, that he is well animated. His shoulders are quite obliquely set against the frontal plane, giving him added depth. His lips and his eyes look as though the affable young man is about to break into a smile. The figure beside him evokes a more serious response. His mouth is tight, his eyes, lacking the glossy white fleck of the other images, seem less engaged to us, more contemplative. He also has an elongated neck, an aquiline nose, light beard, brows, and eyelashes, and he too has a golden wreath upon his head and a sword belt strapped across his chest. Another series of images, this one actually has a name attached. It says Aline and her children. Now, Aline, the inset female adult, is very fashionable. She's rendered with an up-to-date hairdo of circa 50 AD, indicated by the central part in her hair and the falling locks around her fringe. Also stylish are the large drippy earrings that she wears and the rather grand golden necklace. The modeling of the flesh in this image is particularly accomplished, with the texture of the skin perceptibly observed. Her eyes appear tired, almost mournful. The children's portraits show exaggerated eyes, very chubby cheeks, and prominent strawberry lips. The style is different to Aline, suggesting that they were rendered at a different time, perhaps later by a different artist. There are lots of white highlights in these images and very strong pink tint to give them that spark of life noted in the other images. So here with those two children's portraits, you start to get a sense of the broader context of the images. The portraits, all of them, were part of a different context which involved mummified corpses. They served to cover the faces of the defunct to ready them for burial. These examples indicate that they were mounted into the bands of cloth that were used to wrap the bodies, which you can see in this area here. See how they sort of strap down those wooden panels to hold them in place. In some cases, nail marks were evident at the edges of the images. So the images themselves were painted on very thin, pliable wood of the linden tree or the lime tree. So this particular tree has wood that is highly resistant to splitting or deforming, so that they can gently fold around the contours of the wrapped bodies. Okay, the modern wooden supports that we often see behind the images give the impression that these portraits were rectangular, but in fact they were not. They were normally rounded at the top and often slanted or irregularly shaped, allowing them to be easily placed on the mummy and secured by the linen wrappings. They were painted along the longitudinal axis of the wood grain to minimize facial distortions due to the warping or the cracking of the wood, which would be inevitable after time. The underlayer of the paint is usually a calcium-based ground, possibly white, but sometimes darker pigments were involved. The palettes were generally lead white and earth pigments. They also used sometimes mordant gilding, which you saw in the images of the wreaths on the heads of the two figures. Mordant gilding is essentially thin layers of gold leaf, which is affixed via adhesive to the panel, maybe using gum arabic, which is probably, given that it was produced in the African continent, was probably the appropriate adhesive to use. So gum arabic, very, very thin pieces of gold attached to the surfaces to give an extra impression of wealth and light and texture to the image. The technique used almost across the board, but not always, is encaustic, which is a mixed media technique by which natural pigments are added to melted beeswax. It's incredibly durable as a technique, and in fact, it was the technique used for waterproofing ships in the ancient world. In all of the portraits, we have noted a striking naturalism, rendering the images, as they're often described, as poignant, immediate, sensitive. This is a consistent trend that lasted about 3 centuries. So we cannot put it down to happenstance, but instead we must see the naturalism of these portraits as a deliberate choice made by the artists and their patrons, and no doubt demanded by their context. So the next question then that we need to ask ourselves is, what was the purpose of the images? The encaustic portraits were all associated with mummified bodies, as I mentioned, and thus related to funerary rituals and religious beliefs. Unfortunately, most have been removed from their original burial sites, dispersed all around the world. Even more distressing is that the portraits, other symbolic images, and the mummies have themselves been separated. So they're no longer together in and of themselves. To understand the portraits, let's consider briefly the religious beliefs of the ancient Egyptians. Sorry, I meant to show this image before, and this just shows an adolescent mummified body, which still has the mummy portrait attached, and this is of an adolescent boy in the British Museum to this day. So at least that one's still intact and the mummy is still there. So I'm very pleased to see that. And it's not on display either, which is a good thing. What are they for? To understand the portraits, we need to consider the religious beliefs of the ancient Egyptians. So in summary, ancient Egyptians believed in rebirth. The essential aim of each individual was to be reborn, to have his or her soul nourished for eternity, and thus to achieve a beautiful death. To do this, one had to mimic the ideal model, the mythic afterlife journey of the pharaoh god Osiris, whose body was defiled and torn asunder by his enemy brother Seth. The body was later found and reassembled by Osiris's sister and wife, Isis. Isis had Osiris embalmed, effectively becoming the first mummy in Egyptian history, after which he became king and judge in the land of the dead. Here he remained permanently benevolent and youthful. He's a symbol of fertility, kindness, and afterlife. Thus, his death and resurrection was the model of the beautiful death. In order to achieve everlasting perfection like Osiris, Egyptians had to go through the same purification rituals and needed to sustain their afterlife souls. Hence all the contraptions and imagery associated with death. There are many funerary texts, signs, symbols, actual food, and images of food associated with Egyptian graves. All are meant to support the deceased's journey to the afterlife and to help preserve their souls. Images of the jackal-headed god Anubis embalming corpses, of Osiris's mythic victory over death, of scarab beetles that protect the dead, the Ankh, the symbol of eternal life, were all lavished on coffins, shrouds, walls, and in funerary texts like this one here, Hunefer's Book of the Dead, which was full of magic spells to help him along to the next life. And here is a stylized portrait of Hunefer, who was a deceased scribe. We have many different images here that I've just spoken of. Here's the figure of Osiris himself, always with the conical crown on his head. And he is depicted enthroned with Isis and her sister and sister-in-law, Nephthys, who were the ones who found him and reattached his body and had him embalmed. And so the supporters in the afterlife. Over here we have Horus, who was the son of Isis and Osiris, but he is the guide who takes the dead to Osiris in the afterworld. What's important here is you notice he's holding the Ankh. There's a better image of it up there for you, which is the symbol of eternal life. So from what I'm seeing here, Hunefer has successfully achieved the afterlife. He's being admitted to the chamber of Osiris. So there's all these symbols, all these texts. There's much more in this image I'm not going to get into, but all of this helps to lead the deceased to the afterlife. The mummy shroud here, which I'm showing you, it's not the best image, but it was one of the only ones I could find that would really work in this context, shows an interesting intersection of our funerary portraits, which you can see on the top end of the sarcophagus, and the visual images and texts which assist the deceased in the afterlife. So along the side, it's very hard to see, unfortunately, but along the side, you can see that there are images here, like the ones I've just shown you, which are all leading the deceased to the afterlife. So here we have that combination of portrait and that conceptual framework of Egyptian visualizing techniques that we normally associate with ancient Egypt. So the two come together, and that's how I think we even need to read our funerary images, because they do belong together. Both the image and the text and the hieroglyphs take the deceased to the next world. A more overt image of this desire for perfection in imitation of Osiris is this mummy shroud. Here it's laid flat, opened up and laid flat, obviously taken off the mummy, but you can imagine it wrapped around a figure so that the head would be, placed on top of the actual head of the figure, and these parts here would be along the side of the corpse. So this one here enshrouded the corpse of a person called Aaemka, and he is depicted here with the wings of the messenger god Hermes up here, and in the form of Osiris, he has the fake beard of Osiris, which you can see just below the chin there. And he has, again, remember the conical crown on top. And so flanking the central image are the pictograms, again, of the women, Isis and Nephthys, who are performing rituals. And we also have, you can just see the jackal-headed god here, the god of embalming, just below there. And so they all come together to reenact this story of the perfect death, the original perfect death of Osiris. So all the elements come together for this figure called Aaemka, so that he becomes Osiris, essentially, in the afterlife. An essential element of the afterlife, which is important to our focus today, is the concept of the soul. The soul was believed to be multifaceted in ancient Egypt. Two parts essential to our understanding of the portraits are the Ka, Ka, and the Ba, Ba. The Ka survived the body's death and resided in a picture or a statue of a person on earth. This element of the soul was understood to protect the earthly family of the deceased. The Ba, another aspect, is the person herself, her personality in essence. Both the Ba and the Ka traveled in and out of the body, the deceased body, of course, returning for sustenance each night, hence all the grave goods and the foods, etc., that you find in tombs. Importantly, the Ba and the Ka had to recognize the deceased to be renourished, and so recognizable likenesses or cartouches with the names of the deceased were critical in graves. And I think that's the key to our portraits, that recognizable likeness, so vividly painted on our portraits. I'll give you an example that is not of the portraits, but an earlier example of some grave portraits. And here are an earlier Old Kingdom pharaoh, Mycerinus, and his queen, whom I'm just going to call Kami, because I don't know how to say her name properly. So this is Mike and Kami to me, actually. That's what I call them. They exhibit an exquisite naturalism. You can see the soft contours of their profiles, the expressive lips, the confident tilt of their heads. These are juxtaposed with a stark idealism. Notice they have no wrinkles. They are completely symmetrical. We'll see another image of them from the front, and very youthful and beautiful. The statues do not reflect the real deceased person, in this case the king, but encapsulate his essence so that his soul could successfully commune between the body and the other worlds daily. So that's the typical tradition of the Egyptian afterlife and funerary practices in a nutshell. But here's where it gets complicated. The historical period of the mummy portraits is essentially at a critical point in Egyptian history in which many cultures fundamentally assimilate. So here I will discuss two key historical moments: the occupation of Egypt by Alexander of Macedon and his heirs, and the conquest of Egypt by Rome. In 322 BC, I don't know why I have 332 BC. I think it's 322 BC. I might have that wrong. Alexander of Macedon invaded Egypt. He was seen by many as a liberator. So the Egyptians were effectively under the control of the Persians at that point. Alexander set up essentially Greek political and social structures within Egypt. After his death, Ptolemy I Soter, one of his generals, claimed Egypt under his rule, with the Ptolemaic dynasty lasting until 30 BC. So here you can already see that cultural entanglement that I've been talking about, that I mentioned earlier: Greek, Macedonian, no doubt Persian, and native populations integrated and intermarried in the course of the Ptolemaic period. They formed a social base in which conditions were suitable for interpenetration of Hellenistic and Egyptian cultures. So we already see the beginning of that interaction between cultures, between Egyptian and Eastern cultures, as early as the 4th and 3rd centuries BC. In 30 BC, the Romans decisively defeated Cleopatra, the last Ptolemaic pharaoh of Egypt, and ended Egypt's long, relatively independent history. Roman occupation of the kingdom under Augustus Caesar is a determining context for our discussion. Like elsewhere in the Mediterranean, the Romans introduced to Egypt their infrastructure, their politics, and their culture. It is useful in this context to remember that the Romans now also lorded over the previous independent Greek states. So Greece and its offshoots were a great source of inspiration, culturally, politically, philosophically, to the Romans. The Romans began to absorb Greek and Hellenistic ideas well before this time, ideas fundamentally integrated into their own artistic canon by the time they occupied Egypt. When occupiers confronted the occupied, however, they also absorbed much of the cultural legacy already in existence. So colonization is never a one-way street. Culture, particularly, tends to be more fluid, moving not simply from the occupier to the occupied, but possibly more powerfully from the occupied to the occupier. The Mediterranean Sea, of course, has always been a significant conduit for exchange, never a barrier, which is how we see it today, but as a vehicle for exchange and cultural contact. For this reason, it's actually very difficult to define what is specifically Roman or Greek or Egyptian when it comes to our mummy portraits. So this is why I'd like to think about it in terms of cultural entanglement. Cultural entanglement, by definition, is the process by which colonizing powers and indigenous peoples influence one another and change together over time. So now we need to answer the question about, well, what is being entangled exactly? And so I'm going to generally focus on funerary context here, but the story is obviously a much greater one. So I'm going to look at representation in Egypt, in Greece, and the Hellenistic world, and Imperial Rome. For our purposes here, probably the rich visual, literary, and symbolic corpus of thousands of years of Egyptian art and religious practice is critical. Egyptians had established systems of representation that remained pretty much unchanged since the Old Kingdom, that is 2700 BC. A standard set of Egyptian artistic conventions govern visual representation. These are dominated by, when we look back at the Mycerinus and Khamerernebty image, dominated by stylized figuration. So that means images that are effectively look human, but are idealized with very little of the sort of surface, the surface texture of the body. We don't have wrinkles, we don't have pimples, we don't have any sort of extraneous detail. The figures are usually flat, particularly in the two-dimensional images, which I'll show you in a minute, rather rigid, so there's not a lot of animation in the figures, and they often show composite poses. Again, I'll show you that in a minute, and severe symmetry. So if you look, for instance, at this image of the king, you can almost cut him down the middle, except for a few details, and he will be exactly the same on either side. The same goes with the queen. Cut her down the middle, and effectively, she's identical on both sides. And so it's this kind of ideal of symmetry that we're thinking about in terms of the conceptual framework of the Egyptians. Another image, this is the longer version of that, that papyrus that I showed you a few minutes ago relating to Hunafur and his Book of the Dead. So here we have, again, I've written a number of words down the bottom of the screen because these are, in terms of the visualizing strategies that Egyptians use, these are the key features. There is a expressive linearity within all of their compositions. So that means they're quite flat and rigid and outlined. The figures often show composite poses, and I'll show you, I think it's a very good example here with Osiris, whose head is in profile, his body is facing forward, and his feet are in profile. So it's the composite pose, which is meant to emphasize the manliness of the figure, showing his broad shoulders and his thin waist, so usually associated with muscularity. We did notice that here with Mycerinus. That very, very thin waist and the very broad shoulders with the pectoral muscles. So that idea of youth and power are very much integrated into that visualizing system. Again, here, there's no depth or perspective in the images. Even with going back to Mycerinus, there are only two visualizing positions in Egyptian sculpture, the front or the side. There is nothing else. There's no sense of an integrated whole, or a kind of, like Renaissance sculpture or even classical Greek sculpture, where you start to move around the object organically. Now, there's only a front and a side on these, and that's it. Nothing else was really considered. So you get the same effect here with the two-dimensional images, where there's no sense of depth. It wasn't important. The images are all on the frontal plane. In this image here, hieratic size is quite important, and it is a significant feature of almost all Egyptian art. What hieratic size means is that the most important figure in the composition is larger than the rest. So the figure of Osiris has been isolated in this canopy. He's enthroned, and if he stood up, he would be much taller than all the other figures. So he's clearly the dominant and most important figure in the composition. Even if we go back to Mycerinus, he is closer to the viewer. He's a taller figure. He's the prominent feature of the sculptural group. So he, in a way, is a hieratic figure as well. So all of these particular characteristics of Egyptian art are not naturalistic techniques. They don't evoke reality. This is really looking at a different kind of reality that is particular to encapsulating the figural representation of the ancient Egyptians. These particular and enduring conceptual frameworks fundamentally are tied to the underlying function of our funerary portraits, serving specifically the needs of the deceased and their otherworld journey. The religious and visual ideas were intermingled with visual practices of the Hellenistic world, especially during the Ptolemaic dynasty. The Greek tradition was very powerful, very powerfully concerned with imitating reality from a very early day. So the Greeks too had established systems of representation which aimed to render figures with increasing naturalism. So automatically you can probably see on our kouros, our youth on the left here, an attachment to Egyptian ideals of manliness. And so there is a definite connection already between the Egyptians and the classical Greek sculptors. Here, though, with our kouros of Anabasis, we see a figure who is very much starting to contend with reality, so a kind of naturalism evoked in the figure. Both of these figures were associated with graves. We have here a very rigid figure. Again, that muscularity is very powerful. We start to see the parts of the body start to form an organic whole, but there's still sort of composite. There's a symmetry in the figure, again, cutting him down the middle, identical on both sides. A stylization in the hair, which you can see there's plaits which are identical on both sides. So there's a figure here which starts to evoke reality. It moves on from the Egyptian model to something new. But when we get to 480 BC, the Greeks adapted a new conceptual framework, again, always driving towards that naturalism, where with the Critias boy, we see a new harmonious body, a figure of naturalistic proportions with elastic skin, which brings the body together. It's no longer a composite of parts. It is a natural flowing front and back and side. You can walk around the figure. You're encouraged to walk around the figure by virtue of its surface texture and the softness of the contours. Most importantly, the Greeks devised this, what is called an S-curve or contrapposto stance, which is a special device which basically just flicks out the hip, twists the head, reorients the shoulders. And if you think about it, how you stand naturally, this is what the figure is representing, that kind of waiting for the bus, and you flick your hip out just to wait, and your whole body interacts. It's like a chain reaction through your body, a current of animation that flows through the figure and gives it a sense of vivaciousness, of liveliness, of animation. So that's what the Greeks were doing. They're always moving towards this sense of naturalism. Even still, in the classical period, the figures are very much idealized. There is a sense of an interiority, perhaps, of expression in especially the figure of the Critias boy, where he's a thinking figure. His sort of puckered lips give away a sense of something's going on. The tilt of his head, he's not staring straight out, but he is looking at something. Unfortunately, his eyes have been gouged out because there are probably some expensive jewel or what have you in the eye, so they've been taken away. But were he to have them, they would have been sort of more engaged with the viewer. This kind of naturalism slowly is being developed in ancient Greece. Hellenistic portraiture, as we move on in time chronologically, again, largely coming from the Greek world, but moving beyond the borders of Greece proper, was very much part of the drive towards naturalism. We start to see a movement away from the idealized figures of the ancient Greeks. The portraits start to take on new qualities, which we can see here: personality and emotion. So this first figure here is an image of Demosthenes, the Athenian statesman, created well after his death, but still evoking a sense of the pensive, strong character that he was known to be. The face is turned down. He's got a kind of pensive expression. He might even be pursing his lips a little bit or bringing them together in thought. So this sense of something else going on in the figure we start to see in Hellenistic portraiture. The next image of a Ptolemaic queen is also interesting. There's enough here to give a sense that this is the portrait of the young queen. The hairstyle itself, it is still stylized, but you start to get a sense of a particular stylistic hairdo occurring there. The small eyes, the rounded eyebrows, which sort of frame her eyes, and again, the puckered mouth. It's a very idealized image, but we're starting to get a sense of an individual coming through. And the final image, of course, the bronze head of a man from the 1st century BC, found near Delos, we see an emergent personality coming to the fore. The depth of character in his eyes, the twist of his head, the puckered mouth, the sort of chubby cheeks and neck, it all gives him a very particular individual appearance. It's particularly apparent because of the way his head twists and his eyes look upwards. So it's kind of a dynamic image. Again, that's starting to push towards this extreme naturalism that the Greeks had been desiring for some time. Now, the Roman tradition, which is continually influenced by Greek and Hellenistic art, goes even further. The Romans assimilated the traditions of the Hellenistic East and gave them a new life in a new context. The importance of capturing the actual appearance of a person became an established element of their systems of representation, and was directly related to the funerary context, which again links us back to our Roman Egyptian portraits. So here I refer to the custom of the Roman nobility of displaying imaginos, images of their ancestors, usually death masks, but sometimes busts, in small domestic altars within the home, where they worship them as guardians of the family. These figures ensured the family's prosperity and indeed their fertility. In funeral processions, wax masks were worn by professional mourners to emphasize the continuity of an illustrious family line, but also to keep the dead present. Obviously, a key element of this remembrance was likeness. Look at the Roman patricians in this central image here. We have the living figure holding the heads or the busts of two dead figures. They all have individual features. They have, the one on the further one is balding, a bit of chubbiness under the neck. Here we have a stern figure with a particular hairdo, pointed nose, and this guy has carved cheeks, a very long nose, and a very pensive expression, perhaps one of empathy or remembrance. In funeral processions, these were meant to keep the dead present, and they were all meant to offer a sense of continuity and importance to the family line. So it's a status marker. The important thing is, though, whether in the family home or on display in procession, the images had to evoke, or meant to evoke, the remembrance of the actual person. So some other images which evoke this sense of Roman verism, that true to life characterization in portraiture, is this very famous image of Caecilius Jucundus from Pompeii. And again here, this is just such a fabulous image, a bronze image full of character, the twist of his mouth and the squinting of his eyes. This is a man of great intellect and power and strength, even though his position itself was not one of great power. He was certainly a man of the people and a thinking person, and it really captures that kind of essence of Caecilius. The Roman patrician below him, again, the craggy old face, which of course was so important in ancient Rome because wisdom was associated with age, as well it should be. And here we have this figure who, there's nothing idealistic. He looks like a grumpy old man, and that's exactly, what he has been portrayed as. So it's a really different way of representing portraits and people in the Roman world. That is Roman verism. Again, that's the style. The development of mummy portraiture in Roman Egypt may be strongly influenced by this rich Roman funerary tradition, since it appears in Egypt only after Egypt was established as a Roman province. Oh, here's one more example. I forgot about this. I put this in at the last minute of a potential argument for the strong Roman presence or stylistic influence on those mummy portraits. This is an image of a family, a man and a woman who were bakers in Pompeii in the 1st century AD. And again, the likeness of these figures to those mummy portraits is absolutely stark. Like they are just they have such a striking affinity to those contemporary funerary masks. Again, some of the features that we might want to think about are the large eyes, those captivating eyes, the use of chiaroscuro, or the light and dark modeling to create a sense of three-dimensionality, the engagement with the viewer, the puckered lips, the tinting of the faces to give them that very much alive appearance. And if you look at the female baker, she has that wonderful hairdo that we saw with Aline earlier on the mummy portrait, with the little strands of hair coming down in the part in the middle of her hair. So these are really up to date, reasonably well-to-do people in Pompeii, and very much alive, very much present in the world. Don't they look so much like our mummy portraits? It's the sum total of all these traditions, Egyptian, Hellenistic, and Roman, along with their past and present contexts, that become entangled to create in this new context a new product, the mummy portrait. We can only understand this if we see the mummy and its portrait as a coherent language system, one that communicated not to this world, but to the next, with the likeness and presence so well captured in the mummy portraits having a critical role. Remember the spark of life we noted in the portraits. I think this is the key. Not only do they evoke natural forms, and arguably an actual person, but the liveliness and animation that gives them extraordinary presence is something to be remarked upon. Was this new naturalism then an innovative tactic aimed at securing the attention of the soul, the ka and the ba? Did it foreshadow how things would be in the future eternal? In a new historical moment that mixed Hellenistic, Egyptian, and Roman worldviews, was the new naturalism the obvious or natural solution to guaranteeing passage into the next world? When we prioritize only the one element of the bundle, in this case, the portrait, because of its intrinsic appeal to our modern sensibilities, we miss some fundamental points. Mummy and portrait, sometimes text and images, work together to guarantee the deceased a beautiful death. The alluring images remained a critical contact point for the soul, a presage of what was to come, and signaled the transformation of the deceased into the perfect afterlife form. I've added, in the end, just some works that people might find interesting, and of course the images and where they were taken from. So thank you. That's something of this amazing topic. I don't know if anybody has any questions or comments, but that's sort of where we are at the moment.
Oh, sure. Thank you very much, Karen. This has been the most incredibly beautiful presentation. And what I particularly enjoyed was the progression from the static hieratic statues in or the 2500 BC, or the pharaohs, so graciously depicted, but then slowly coming to this through the Greek Kouros and the Roman Pompeii and Fayum, to this verism and reality of this fantastic pictures. I would, to some degree, progress this. I would like to progress it as my own idea, to bring this verism back to Ravenna and to the Byzantine mosaics, who are also quite front shape, static and hieratic, but it still maintains some of the details in the verism. Obviously, we had to go to Giotto to break up from the Byzantine tradition and come up to a different presentation. It's been a most beautiful presentation. Thank you very, very much. I would like really to invite anybody to put questions or to Karen if they want some further clarification or make some comments on it.
Karen, Peter Radcliffe, can you hear me?
Yes, I can, thank you.
Right, the Fayum cache, were they native Egyptians, Romans, or even Greeks? Do we know?
It's a really difficult question because of the long-term interaction of peoples in the Mediterranean, and especially within Egypt, having the sort of Macedonian or Hellenistic power there for some time, for 300 years. It is likely that many of the images were actually Hellenistic, previously Greeks, but the reality is everybody intermarried and intermingled, and so there was no pure Greek or Egyptian type. And then enter the Romans, you know, so it just gets mixed up again. So that's why I think that idea of entanglement is a nice way of looking at it. I was talking about religious practices and visuality, but I think genetics are also getting entangled in this particular situation. So to answer your question, I don't think we can say that it was Roman, Egyptian, or Greek who was buried in those places. They are Roman burial sites, but well, that's how they're described. Why are they called Roman? Because they took place in the Roman period, but we don't know who's in the grave. It needs some DNA analysis.
It certainly accounts for a tremendous interaction if they are, say, Romans who have taken on some Egyptian styles in their burial, and clearly some of the Egyptian beliefs, but with Roman visual stylistics and changing it. I think that's fascinating.
It is.
I would say that if you walk in the streets of Naples, in the streets of Bari or Sicily, and even Rome, or at least Rome 100 years ago, you would meet people with these faces. I support the idea that Rome having become a province and being governed therefore by, Egypt having become a province and therefore being governed by Rome, the earlier government personnel was from Rome, as it happened in other provinces, in Gallia, in England, and so on. But certainly intermingling and entanglement is something that happens into every culture, from Neanderthal to Homo sapiens and so on.
That's right.
So please, anybody else? I'm sure you would like to ask something.
Well, I have another question, if I may.
You're welcome.
Sure.
The artists, what I'm seeing is not mass production. It seems to be very personal portraiture. Looking at all the mummies from that cache, was it a wide range of styles or more limited and perhaps to a few artists?
No, because it's a wide range. Let me just pop up. Can I just share the images again? Where's my share? So stylistically, they are quite different, but they also take place, Peter, over 300 years. I think most of these ones that I've actually picked happen to be around about the 1st century, more or less, but you're talking about 50 years apart even. But even just look at these three, they're all very, very different. At a glance, they kind of look the same. They have the same kind of general characteristics, but the quality of the painting and the style of the painting is very different. So if we look at the female figure on our left, she's very soft in her contour. She almost looks Rubenesque, or something like that, the kind of soft contouring of the body of the figure with the gentle transition from one tone to one hue to another. She's very delicately rendered. Whereas if you look at the fellow in the middle, you can actually see the brush strokes, even on this, in Zoom, in a digital device, you can actually see the very, thick brush strokes. Maybe we can even look here around his neck. You can see the white splotches sort of, so that's kind of almost roughly painted. So it's a very different style to her. And this one again, it's the coloration is different. I suspect it has had some issues with just passage of time. So there's not a lot of modeling compared to this one. She's closer to the female one, but we're seeing a lot of undertone in this image. But if I can just quickly go back to her eye, if we look at this one here, look at all the different colors. And the brushwork that you can see in her eye. So she's closer to that first female, but quite different as an end product. And then this guy here, he almost looks like a drawing, a caricature. So there's a lot of linearity and hard lines in his image. So I think they're all different, and there was probably, a bunch of artists at particular times who would have gotten the job, and they would have all followed a general program, but I think more or less the individual stylistic features are really abundantly clear.
Thank you very much. How many portraits were there altogether in the cache?
Well, altogether, including images from all over Egypt, there are about 900 that we know of.
Thank you.
Somebody has a chat that would like to ask questions? Karen, you can click on that. Maybe you can.
I'm just seeing lovely comments from people. I don't see any questions, but thank you, people.
Okay.
That's okay.
Yes. Well, it's a really fantastic thing. It's a, as I said, I'm born in Rome, and these things are particularly dear to my heart. And Karen, you've been marvelous. And really, on behalf of everybody, I will join my hands in a virtual and real clap, because it's really fantastic. You're well prepared, and we listen to you very attentively. Thank you very, very much again.
Oh, it's wonderful to, again, be able to just explore this topic in much more detail. So thank you for the opportunity. It's been really marvelous.
You've done a fantastic job. Thank you very much again. And thank you to everybody else who I tried to gallery review again. To Sandra, to Antonella, to Josephine, to Chris, Cassandra, the others. Whoa. And some others that are missing. I know they were supposed to be here. So we leave the meeting now, and thank you very, very, very much again.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, everybody.
Thank you, grazie.
Bye-bye.